today for our webinar. This webinar is focused on the integration of faith and health in recovery. We're going to be hearing today from two individuals, Jason Jonker and Dan Solofra, about resilient recovery, which is a faith-based approach to addiction using biblical teachings of law and gospel to encourage sustained and maintained behavior change aligned with Christian values and beliefs. We really appreciate you joining us today and look forward to the conversation. This webinar is hosted by the CCIH Integration of Faith and Health Working Group. My name is Jason Paltzer. I am one of the co-chairs of this working group, and I am the executive director of the Meros Center. If you're new to Christian Connections for International Health, CCIH is an international network of approximately 115 Christian organizations, 15 affiliated partners, as well as a few hundred individual members, all working in over 90 countries. CCIH's mission is to promote health and wholeness from a Christian perspective and provides opportunities for capacity building, networking, fellowship, and advocacy. This webinar is part of one of the working groups of CCIH. That working group is the integration of faith and health. This is one of two webinars in a series of webinars where we are exploring the theological, theoretical, and practical aspects of how faith and health are interrelated across health disciplines. You can learn more about the working group and its charter on the CCIH website and through a link provided in the chat, which should be there in a sec. You can use that to learn more about the working group. And if you'd love to join, we would love to have you. We're always looking for new members for our working group, members in health, in development, in church leadership, seminary students, faculty, pastors. We're looking for a nice mix of individuals to explore this topic. A few housekeeping comments before we get started. As I mentioned, if you're just logging in, please introduce yourself in the chat box, your role and where you are joining from today. We have two presenters. Each will present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a time for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question during the presentation, feel free to load it in the chat box. We will capture those questions and we'll bring them in at the end for both Jason and Pastor Dan. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the CCIH YouTube channel and posted on the CCIH website at ccih.org, events, and then webinar recordings. You will all get a link to the recording when it's ready through your email. With that, I would like to get us started. So as I mentioned before, my name is Jason Paltzer, and I am the Executive Director of the Meros Center and also Senior Director of Research Innovation at Kingdom Workers and visiting professor at Wisconsin Lutheran College. I have experience in global health, community development, and really working on exploring community health ministry, which is why I love co-chairing this integration of faith and health working group, because that's what our research is about, is really moving this needle forward and developing evidence base around our understanding of faith and health. With that, I want to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dan Solofra. He is the senior pastor at CrossWalk Church in Phoenix, Arizona. He and his wife of 31 years, Tanya, have 5 adult children and 1 grandson, and that grandson is fairly new, and I know he's pretty excited to talk about his new grandson. Pastor Dan is part of a coaching network of about 150 pastors. The network is called CrossTrain, and they focus on spiritual, physical, emotional, and rational help for pastors. He also works closely with CrossWalk's Resilient Ministry, which serves both individual members who are in recovery as well as recovery group homes. Pastor Dan is my pastor, and really grateful for him to be here today and share with us his experience. So with that, Pastor Dan, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Jason said, I am a pastor. This year is my 30th year of ministry, so it's been I spent first 20 years in a church plant, where a church that I started, and now 10 years I've been in Phoenix, Arizona. And as we talk about the integration of faith and health, the faith part of it maybe to help you understand coming from a church perspective is, my training. I went to a Christian school for my grade school. I went to a prep school that prepared you for ministry. I went to 4 years of a Bible college, and in that time studied Greek, Hebrew, history, then 4 years of a master's program at seminary, and trained in systematic theology. And so it was very heavy on the faith part of it, and specifically the teaching of God's word, which I am eternally grateful for. But then what happened with my ministry is I was assigned to an area without a church. And so all of the things that I kind of had been trained to do within a church, uh, they really didn't apply. What I needed to do is figure out how to start a church. So I went door to door, met with people. That went on for a number of years. God blessed it. The church went well. We got more and more people. We were able to build a building. Then we built an addition to the building. And at that time, we were probably about 500 members, maybe 250 people attending on a weekend. And then there was a weekend where my son, I still remember it, he was in 8th grade, and he was in a basketball tournament that I went to see. And as they were playing a game, very close game, back and forth with 5 seconds left, our team had the ball, down by 1 point. And my son, they had the ball, passed him the ball, shot a 3-point shot and made it to win the game. And in this grade school tournament, all the parents went down on the floor, and it was exciting, except for me. I left the building. And the reason why is I was having tightness in my chest. I didn't know what was going on. I wasn't feeling good. And make a long story short, my wife was concerned about me. I was concerned about me. And I believed at that time that I was having a heart attack. And I was taken into the emergency room. They took it very seriously. I was kept overnight. The next day I did a stress test, and they said, "Dan, there's nothing wrong with your heart. You're healthy. You're very healthy." And wow, that's strange. I wonder what that could be. And it wasn't until I was probably about 40 years old, what I was having was a panic attack. And it didn't make sense to me because everything in my life seemed to be very successful, that I was, the church was going well. That was my definition of successful. But at that time, I did not realize that even though God had blessed what we were doing personally, I was very, very, very unhealthy. And that started a whole thing for me, because after I had this panic attack, the anxiety stayed. And it got to a point where it was so bad that that as a pastor, I would preach sermons, and I would literally throw up in the side room while a hymn was playing before the message. And I had never done that. I was never nervous. This was never a problem for me. And now all of a sudden it was debilitating. And so, again, with the grace of God and the family of the church and the surrounding, community, there was an individual who talked to me and said, "Dan, I don't know if you realize that there's more to more to life and more to health than just uh, the spiritual part of it. Because for me, it was like every problem was a spiritual nail, and God's word was the hammer. That's how it would fix everything. And He explained to me, that as you look at when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and all your mind, that as you look at yourself, definitely your soul, your faith life is a part of it. But there's also, besides spiritual health, there's physical health, there's emotional health, and rational health, and how you think. And that began a journey for me of understanding exactly what health and faith looked like. And that's when I began, and the explanation that was used to me was, Dan, if you fell and you broke your arm, I'm sure you would pray about it, but I'm also sure you would probably go to a doctor, and you would have him look at your arm and maybe set it and put it in a cast. And you would also want to let your wife know about that and talk to her about it. And so that's when I began to understand that this relationship of how God really made me personally, to begin to understand it personally. And then what happened from that moment was uh, that I started to change. I did. My understanding started to change, and as I saw these components of health, and how they fit, it changed my preaching, it changed my counseling, and it really has changed for me kind of the holistic approach to health, um, and understanding that it's part of how God made me, and God made us, and God made all people. And even times, for instance, I've been married for 31 years. My wife and I are very passionate people, I'll put it that way. So there's times when we have some pretty passionate arguments, disagreements. And I realize that sometimes that I can be talking to her, and I can I am being sinful by not showing love to her. But sometimes on those days, what I really need is a nap. Sometimes what I really need is just a drink of water, or maybe some food, that there are other issues going on that are leading to this. And so the way this all started then to culminate and come together in a way that we believed we could share this with the congregation is when I met Jason Jonker, who was in counseling, and he'll kind of give his background in just a moment. And we started and we wrote a message series called Jesus the Healer. And that was the beginning of the change, of just looking at the healing that Jesus brings to us, and starting even then physical health by resting in Jesus and his promises, of recognizing there are things beyond our ability, that we go to the Lord, that we express our need to be able to say, I need help, to seek his presence and power, to begin to see the freedom that Christ has won for us. And so again, I was dealing with this from especially the spiritual side. That's kind of my expertise. And so we started then, and this a recovery ministry that was definitely Jason Jonker's idea, that was kind of his approach. And so it changed the way also that we started looking at recovery, because for me, in many ways, I looked at what I needed as recovery. Maybe I don't have an issue with alcohol and drugs, but I was self-medicating other ways. Especially, I would say the biggest one was like with food, or just, um, binge watching shows, or just trying to uh, go numb, mentally and emotionally, to try to feel nothing. And so that as we look at this, that it started to realize that there are tools that could be helpful. And so we started this ministry, ironically, though, thinking that we could help people with drinking problems. I didn't think it would necessarily help me with what I was going through. And one of the things that as we did the ministry and it changed was a day when Jason and I were talking, and the words of that really for me sunk in were from Titus chapter 3. And in Titus chapter 3, beginning with verse 3, where he said, "At one time we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved in all kinds of passions and pleasures." And I love that because I think it shows what addiction is, being enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We live in malice and envy, hated and hating one another. But when the kindness and love of Jesus, our Savior, appeared, he saved us, not because of righteous things we had done, but because of his mercy. He saved us through the washing of rebirth and renewal of the Holy Spirit, whom he poured out on us generously through Jesus Christ, our Savior, so that having been justified by his grace, we might become heirs, having the hope of eternal life. And so that part of it is the being enslaved, that we began to realize that with recovery, these principles, that we're all with sin enslaved, and to see how the kindness and love of Jesus, our Savior, begins to change it. And that's when I realized that theologically, if you're listening from this from a theological point of view, that I had a confessional theology, which is what I learned at the seminary, and then what I would call a practical theology of what I lived in my life. And what I realized is those two theologies need to be the same. That what I believe that also, what does this look like as we live it out? And what has helped us do that is sin and forgiveness, of law and gospel, an approach where we confess the sin, the problem, but also realize what we have in Christ, and to recognize that there are applications of that, both spiritually, physically, what does that mean? How does my behavior change? Emotionally, how am I healthy in my relationships and with other people and with myself? And then also rationally, what can I learn about this? What can I read? How can I understand what I'm going through better by people who have gone through it? So that having been said, Jason, Jonker, I think I can let you, that's kind of the faith point of view of this. And maybe you can explain it kind of from your side.
Thank you, Dan. Again, really grateful. For those of you that noticed, Pastor Dan's video is not on. He's in a place where his bandwidth is pretty low, so we're just grateful that he was able to log in and give his thoughts via audio. So again, thank you. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your just transparency and a clear story of experience, and also your thoughtfulness coming from your role as a pastor, Dan. Really appreciate it, and appreciate you being here. If you have questions regarding anything that Pastor Dan talked about, again, please put that in the chat box, and we will get at them after Jason speaks. I think there's a lot to unpack there, just from the verses in Titus, the focus on confessional theology versus practical theology, and then recognizing the problem in that journey to the gospel and the solution in Christ, and what does that look like. Now I want to introduce Jason Jonker. Jason is a licensed associate marriage and family therapist with over 20 years of experience working in addictions and at-risk populations. He's the chairman of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod's Mental Health Committee. He's been a therapist, clinical director, and regional director for mental health clinics for many years. He is in recovery himself. Jason founded Resilient Recovery Ministry, which provides peer support and faith-based guidance and hope to individuals in recovery. Again, really appreciate Jason being here and sharing his wisdom and taking us into an overview of resilient recovery as the practical piece of this webinar. Jason, I turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Just want to welcome everybody and thank everyone for taking some time to look at this topic. I want to share with you why, after having been a therapist and clinical director for over 20 years, I really prefer Christian ministry as a way of dealing with the problem of addiction. I've got a statement here. Addiction is not a moral failure, which is a statement that really, it proceeds logically from reductive materialism. This idea that there is no spiritual realm, there's only what we can observe, and what we can observe is the only thing that's real. And this is definitely a viewpoint that I encountered over my years as a therapist. Let's go ahead and check out the next slide. I think this viewpoint was probably most emphatically made by Gabor Mate. He said this in a YouTube video, actually, that I watched. He said, "Addiction is not a choice that anybody makes. It is not a moral failure. It is not an ethical lapse. It is not a weakness of character. It is not a failure of will." So let's check out that next slide. So the justification for this, what he just said, would be that alcoholism and other forms of addiction are diseases. And to understand their argument, I think that there's some valid points that they have, but their belief seems to be that shame and guilt are antiquated and they're cruel. And then to call addiction a disease is really to be enlightened, and that this is what will alleviate suffering. If we can just get rid of the old superstitions and antiquated views that we have of addiction, then we can have this enlightened view, and that will really alleviate the guilt and shame and allow people to simply treat addiction from a medical standpoint. So let's go to the next slide. This is a corner that's well known to my pastor and I and to Jason Paltzer, and this is a pretty slow day. This is a corner near our home that typically has clumps of 10 to 35 people. It's an open air drug market and a 24-hour-a-day party. And I was driving past this corner. I was taking someone to a rehab where she was going to share a little bit of her story. And she had been homeless and spent some time on a corner very much like this one. And I have some conflicted views when I drive by the area. And I asked her, like, what do you think when you see these folks sitting here? And she said, she said, it's a choice that I made for 4 years. I was living on the street. There was treatment available to me. There was funding for that treatment. And I chose to live on the street. This was a lifestyle that I preferred and that I chose. And it's just such a contrast from what all of the sort of medical elites would say about addiction. And so I want to kind of hold both of those views at the same time and consider a little bit about this thing called addiction. What is it and how is it treated? If you look at these folks and you ask yourself, what did these guys need to get off the street and to get into gainful employment, to get rid of their addiction and to become, really productive members of society again? They're going to need a fair amount of help. So let's take a look at the next slide. So in terms of it being a disease, there certainly is a medical aspect to addiction. And folks who are coming off of alcohol can have strokes, they can have hallucinations, they can have seizures. And so there's often a need for medical supervision of withdrawal from many addictive substances. In addition, following that initial critical period of, say, 72 hours, people may experience significant cravings for a substance that their body became habituated to. Then there's issues of anxiety, disturbances with sleep and depression, all of which there are medications and medical help for. So we definitely encourage people to meet with doctors, meet with psychiatrists, and take care of the medical side of addiction. Let's take a look at the next slide. There's also, if you think about these folks on the corner there, there's a need for social workers. They at this time probably do not have an ID. They do not have an address. They're not going to be able to apply for a job and get that job. They're going to need help with basic needs, food stamps, housing, vocational training. We'll need to pour into their lives a little bit with some resources to make sure that they can make that tough transition from living on the street to living in a home. Let's take a look at the next slide. There's also definitely a role for psychologists. Folks that are trying to get sober often have a need for goal setting. There may be trauma symptoms that need to be treated. They may need some help with improving their motivation and making sure that they're single-minded in a desire to remain abstinent, and that they're working to resolve some of the ambivalence that they might have. And then also there's a need for interpersonal skills. People who've been living on the street, it's a very violent and dog eat dog kind of environment, and people need to learn how to interact with others in a professional setting, in a family setting, and to not run afoul of the law. So there's definitely a need for personal skills. Let's take a look at the next slide. Also, lawmakers and policymakers can help create conditions that make drug abuse difficult or unattractive, and to make treatment easy to obtain. There's a fantastic book called San Francisco, which talks about the policies in San Francisco that have really allowed a very large open air drug market to flourish. And they have policies, for example, that any theft less than $600 will not be prosecuted. They do not go after individuals with small amounts of drugs on them, and so it just allows for a really flourishing area of crime, prostitution, and drug abuse to rise up. And different policies and different laws and different enforcement would definitely change that situation. Let's take a look at the next slide. There's also very much a need for courts and law enforcement. I heard someone recently say that addiction's one of the only diseases that requires police intervention. And it's true. Many people quit using substances when they obtain a ticket for drunk driving, or when they have a domestic violence charge, or that they've stolen something, or they got caught with drugs and now they have a possession charge. So that is very definitely a pathway that gets people to the services and the treatment that they need. And then in terms of being on probation, folks can be drug tested and checked in on, and so there's some monitoring and supervision that happens as well. Let's go ahead and check out the next slide. So support groups, and that's really the area that Resilient Recovery, the ministry that I oversee, that's really where we live. And so it's just people with the disorder getting together and talking with each other. These groups help lower the stigma. They can help provide people with tools that they need. It also just increases structure. It gives people a place to go to in the evening instead of out to use. And then it really provides a positive peer group when, many times what leads to relapse is a sense of obligation to your drug using peers, and a feeling like if I don't use with you, I think I'm better than you. And so it provides people with a group of peers that's going to support them in their recovery. So let's check out the next slide. You notice absent in this whole list of services and areas that can help with addiction, what's absent is who's going to care for the soul. And when I talk to people who have suffered with addictions, they feel a tremendous amount of guilt and shame. They've been isolated from family members. They have not done what they should have done as parents. They've not done what they should have done as children. They've not met their social obligations. They've stolen. They've engaged in all kinds of criminal activity. And the shame and the stigma around an addiction is huge. And they need help figuring out what to do with all that guilt and shame. And in my experience, telling someone, well, you had a disease, doesn't even begin to touch the depth of what's going on with people. So let's check out the next slide. So an addict has some spiritual needs, and I think the first one of these is actually to remove guilt and shame. This little cycle here was created by Anna Lemke, who's a professor and a researcher and a psychiatrist out of UCLA. And in her practice, she's seen that substance abuse leads to shame pretty universally, and then people lie to cover up that shame or to hide their shame. And that lying behavior begins to cause them to be isolated from others. Well, you know, what happened to my jewelry? They lie about stealing it. They don't set things straight. And people eventually begin to kind of take a step back and push these people out of their lives because they're not able to take all of the lying and the deceptive behavior. It leads to the isolation. Being isolated, then it just sets you up. You're not connected to a job. You're not connected to a family, or at least you're very distant from them and they're upset with you. And that makes using a substance very attractive at that point. So let's go to the next slide. This is really how I conceptualize what happens in a meeting, is that we've got folks who've used substances, they have shame, but in a meeting where they're meeting with other people who've shared those experiences, there's a time of confession where we just confess, this is what I was doing in active addiction. This is how it impacted my life. These are the things that I'm ashamed of. And we spend some time kind of exploring the depths of that. Once that confession has been completed in a meeting, we ask people to believe in God's forgiveness, and we give them a very practical and hopefully meaningful explanation of why we believe God is so willing to forgive them. And that leads us out of that destructive shame cycle, really into the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, faithfulness, and gentleness, self-control. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is the book that we use. It is a curriculum, and it's divided into 18 lessons. Each lesson has two parts. The first part is that confession side. The second part is that gospel side that reminds us of the forgiveness of God. Let's take a look at the next slide. So we meet in groups of 4 to 12. If we get to 12, we break into smaller groups. And I like this verse here from Isaiah. Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, though they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. And this is an example from a lesson that's up here on your screen. It always begins with a scripture. There's always that self-examination, meditation, law section that has a little something to do with the verse. It explains the verse a little bit. And then there's always two questions that we ask. And we just go around the room and we ask these questions of people. So this particular lesson is really all about asking for help and admitting that we were weak. The verse starts out with, hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me. And it goes on. It's a psalm of crying out to God. So we read that. Then we read a little bit about how difficult it is for us to confess that we have needs. And then I ask people, what led you to ask for help? And what has been the cost of not asking for help? So let's go to the next slide. This is an example of kind of some of the responses that I've seen in a recent meeting. These are not actual pictures of people who were at the meeting, but these are some of the responses that I heard. So one person, when I asked, what led you to ask for help? They said, I told myself my kids would never see me drunk like I always saw my dad. And that's a confession of not only did I grow up in an alcoholic family, but that I'm beginning to do the very things that I disliked about growing up in that family. And I'm bringing that to my children. So it's a very active and meaningful confession. Let's take a look at the next slide. I asked another person, what led you to ask for help? And they said, I just couldn't do it at home and on my own. People would come by and offer me drinks. When there were family celebrations, especially funerals, there was sort of an obligation to show your grief by getting down into the weeds and drinking with other people. And this person just admitted their weakness and that they needed to be somewhere else in order to gain sobriety. Let's look at the next one. This person that I'm thinking of here his father was a pastor on the Navajo reservation, and he became he had a real serious problem with alcohol, living on the streets. And the shame for him of growing up in a Christian household, what he would tell me is, I knew better. I was raised better. I didn't grow up around alcoholism. And yet here I am doing these things. And he ended up in a psych ward, suicidal, with just the guilt and the shame about what he had done. Even after that, he thought, okay, I've been to the psych hospital. I can control it. He went back out and was out for about 3 weeks. He got pancreatitis and almost died. And that was when he was like, I need to ask for help. That was the point that led him to help. So that's again, a very heartfelt and meaningful confession. Let's go to the next slide. This gentleman had a significant problem with alcohol and with anger. And when it was his turn to speak, what led him to ask for help was when he apologized to his daughter for something that he had done in the home, and was really broken up about it. But the daughter said, I've heard this before. And at that point, I realized I did not know how to change it, and I had no hope that I was going to change it. And then once I got into resilient meetings and I saw other people getting honest, it gave me the courage to be honest as well. And I figured, okay, I can start sharing some of the things that are happening in my home because other people are doing that as well. Let's check out the next slide. So after this period of confession where we've asked those questions and people have responded to them, we just read a pronouncement of the gospel. First, we take a moment and we just go to the Lord in silent prayer, and we confess our sins, maybe things that we weren't able to talk about openly with everyone. And then we read this pronouncement of the gospel. And this pronouncement just lets people know that Jesus cares about them, that he has died for them, that it's different each time, and it's connected to what we just confessed, but it's meant to really be an applicable demonstration of how much God wishes to forgive us. Following that, we asked 2 more questions. And so in this one, it was asking anyone else for help might make us feel embarrassed or humiliated. How would Jesus treat you if you asked for help? And folks responded to that, and there were some just really wonderful insights and ideas about what it's like to ask for help from Jesus. And then I changed the questions this most recent time, and I asked, what has been most helpful for you? And people talked about prayer. People talked about individuals in their lives that were helpful. They were in a rehab, and they began talking about the staff at the rehab and really praising them and thanking them. And it became a very beautiful moment of humility and forgiveness. And it's our belief that this moment of knowing that you're forgiven and kind of basking in the light of that, that's what gives us the motivation to change. It's not having someone tell us that we're terrible, and it's not being shamed or being humiliated or being reminded of our sins that necessarily causes permanent change. What causes permanent change is when we recognize that we are forgiven, and that changes our hearts. And out of the joy that we feel for that forgiveness is where we really begin to see a change at the level of the heart. So we can go to the next slide. So just again, to reiterate, this is the cycle that we're going through in every single meeting. So we do that confession, and then we ask people to believe in God's forgiveness. And it's been very powerful. And we've seen baptisms come out of this, and people really become integrated in our church family as volunteers and in other capacities. So it's been very powerful for us. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. So that is it. That's kind of why I enjoy the ministry so much, and a bit of just a look at what a meeting looks like and what Christian ministry could look like for an issue like addiction. So with that, I'll conclude, and I think turn it over to Jason Paltzer.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, number one. Really appreciate your insight, your experience, also your vulnerability, Jason, and sharing with us how you got to this point with developing the resilient model. That shame, guilt cycle leading into the lying, I think is something that resonates with everyone, no matter what culture you're from, no matter what country you're living in, what community you're a part of. It's a part of status. It's a part of showing like you got it together. And yet the more you try, the more the bricks come tumbling down, and you need to rest in Jesus, as Pastor Dan was saying, and how he started out saying that first element of resting in Jesus and his forgiveness really becomes the switch to breaking that, and seeing the theology behind the practice of resilient, how it's applied. I think it was really, really helpful, and appreciate both of you taking the time to put together this information. As you have questions, if you've heard and have a question about anything that Pastor Dan mentioned, or Jason, please feel free to put it in the chat box, and we will address those questions over the next 10 to 15 minutes. One of the things that struck me between the two of you, and for those of you that don't know, Pastor Dan and Jason are part of CrossWalk Ministries here in Phoenix, Arizona. And I think one of the critical parts of having a successful recovery ministry at a church or with an organization is truly the intention behind marrying the ministry with the practice of having a resilient group. Could you tell us a little bit more about how CrossWalk really intentionalizes how recovery is part of the DNA of CrossWalk? It's not just a group that meets on Monday nights.
Yeah, Dan, you want to address that?
Sure. As you're saying that, when Jason and I started, that we really wanted to do this to help people who had drug and alcohol problems. And as we got more and more developing of these materials, we realized that we needed them personally, and it was beginning to change our hearts. And even now that a number of staff go to this on a weekly basis, because this need that we have of going to a place where you can confess. There's plenty of guilt in ministry too. I mean, that a lot of these things, and then those, that for some it's drug and alcohol, but for me, probably more times I just get angry or anxious, and 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 that's where kind of the confessional versus practical theology is. This gives me the practice of, in community with other Christians, for me to confess my sin and be forgiven, and I don't do it to model just for them, even though that it can be that, but it's because I need it desperately. It's part of our health to be there. And that's why when individuals come in, I don't look at them as someone that I'm there for. We're there for each other. And that, I think, is possibly the most, as we look at the sharing of the gospel and the living of it, whether you're a pastor or someone who's sober 7 days, it doesn't make any difference. We need that love and forgiveness in God's eyes. And so for us, it's not a program. It is a spiritual health tool that is used by me, honestly, every week, and a ministry that I'm involved in personally by going to it, not even as leading it, just as a participant.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's changed the demographics of our church. That our church now has a lot of people coming from recovery homes, and there's been initially some kind of cultural conflicts between people who've been longtime church members and people who are coming in essentially from the street. And I think Dan has done a really good job of promoting exactly the message that he just talked about, that from the pulpit, he's exposing his own sins, which makes people feel very comfortable. And he provides leadership to make sure that people know we're not going to see ourselves as two separate groups with two separate issues. We're going to see ourselves as one body and all of us deal with some form of guilt and shame. And we all need this message of forgiveness that Christ gives us. And so I think that's another way that it's really become part of the DNA. And then we've got folks from recovery homes volunteering in different activities that we have. We also have folks from our church that are volunteering to provide gifts, to provide cards of encouragement, to go out to the homes. There's folks that are going to be adopting a rehab this Christmas to provide Christmas gifts. And so there's really been a blessing both ways.
Thanks for sharing that. I think it's really important for Christian health organizations, which are the primary representation in CCIH, our Christian health organizations, to hear kind of how it would practically work in a church setting, because a lot of these organizations partner with churches, and they're from different countries. South Sudan, we have Uganda represented, Zambia represented, Kenya, Bangladesh. So the next question kind of builds on that. As Christian health organizations, what would you say could be a first step to partner with a church to introduce or to possibly work with them on developing a resilient recovery ministry? What could be the first couple steps that a health organization takes to do that?
Yeah, I'll give Dan a chance to answer this in a moment, but I think it's important what Dan said about how it is part of his own spiritual practice. And I do think that in terms of what we do, it's a peer-led program. And so it's important that people are willing to not just promote a program that other people will attend, but that people have experienced this kind of humility and this kind of honesty in their confession. And as Dan shows, it doesn't need to be, you don't need to have had a problem with addiction. And I've seen literally people, the thing they're struggling with is soda because they've got type 2 diabetes, and other folks dealing with depression, other folks dealing with broken relationships. I think in order to do something like this and have it be successful, the people promoting it need to be in recovery themselves, or at least need to be willing to be a participant in recovery meetings. I think if we bring it in as something that's for other people, and we don't have that kind of, not even buy-in, but that kind of experience, it can make it challenging to get something going. Dan, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, for me, Jason, I think of the two, we had two message series. I mentioned one of them, Jesus the Healer. And even now that message series was 6-7 years ago. And it's one that's individuals still talk about today, on how powerful it was, that the healing that Jesus brings is spiritual, physical, emotional. It's to the whole person. And as we look at resilient, Jason, I thought, did a good job of explaining how this is, we're not saying don't go to intensive outpatient therapy. We're not saying don't get physical help. We're saying that this is another component of it that is going to bring that health. The second sermon series we had was more recent, and it was called No Help at All. And it was directed kind of at the church, where people would say, you know what, I have addiction or whatever, but the church is no help at all, because all they said was just stop doing it, or just pray about it, or just, and it's one of those where it's a recognition that, again, we will pray for you, and it's behavior we want to stop, but without giving the tools that we have to help us, and specifically the ones related to us, having to do with the guilt and shame and the issues behind that are kind of driving the addiction, that I think it's important. And for the church, what it's made us realize is, just by putting a word recovery out on a street sign, people come in constantly that we don't know, just because they're looking for recovery. And it's given us a huge opportunity to share Christ and to bring healing in people's lives. So the
Thanks.
first step I would say is talk about it.
Pastor Dan, is that sermon series something that you would be willing to share, or is it an available resource?
Yeah, I definitely can make it available for sure.
Okay. I think that other pastors might really hear about that. As I think about just, again, different cultures represented here in this call and within CCIH, recognizing that it might be different. And in that context, the political, the social context might be different. And it is healthy to take what we call a social ecological approach to kind of understanding the different layers and complexities. But that doesn't mean we just have to be handicapped with what we can do in our organization or with our church partnerships, that there is something we can do to help move this forward. And I love seeing Angela on the webinar from Uganda Christian University. And it made me think of the fact that we do want to understand the cultural differences related to how a resilient recovery might work in different countries. And it's possible that we can work with different organizations to see what adaptations would it look like for resilient to take place in Uganda, or to take place on a college campus, or to take place in a rural setting. That there are those differences. We recognize that, and the Meros Center is partnering with Resilient to help understand that. What are some of those adaptations, but also recognizing that some things are universal. The need for law and gospel, that journey to understand Jesus and the cross and what that means, that salvation for us. Pastor Dan, what you were talking about earlier, at the very beginning, about how we're made, right? How we are made, how God made us, and that we get to rest in that. But it only means recognizing our relationship with God and resting in that each and every week. And we all need that. We all need that continual cycle of remembering who we are, because culture and society is going to bring the shame and guilt to us, whether we like it or not. I just see a raised hand. Nuripin, if you could post your comment or your question in the chat box, that would be great. As Nuripin puts his question there, I just want to highlight the fact that as we're approaching the top of the hour to conclude our webinar, the CCIH conference is coming up. It's going to be at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. from June 5th to the 7th. Registration details are going to be coming later in January, but right now abstracts are being accepted. So please, if you have an idea for an abstract, and it could be around recovery, if this is a topic that's important to you, maybe something you're doing in your own setting or with your own community or church, please consider this as a topic to submit an abstract for. Again, that's June 5th to the 7th, and that conference is going to be in person this year. Really look forward to seeing you there. Again, I'll maybe take one more minute. If there's any other question, Nuripin, if you had that question to come through. As we conclude today, I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you to Jason and Pastor Dan for sharing the important work and the experience, both personally and professionally, in moving forward in this space of Christian faith-based recovery. It's needed now more than ever with where we are globally, and the rise of not just substances, but depression, anxiety, stress. It's just getting more and more intense. And so really encourage you as a health organization, as part of CCIH, to think about what your role might be and to reach out. restinjesus.org is the website for resilient recovery. You can reach out to anybody in CCIH to get connected with Jason or Pastor Dan to learn more.
Is it all right if I answer that question that was Nuripin has put in there? She's
Did
asking.
He post it?
Yeah, she's asking
Okay,
how
great.
we adapt this to the multicultural and different religious cultures. So most of the groups that we do here in Phoenix are actually done in a setting where not everyone is a Christian. When we go to a home, many of the homes have a contract with the tribe, and there are folks that follow traditional Native American practices. We've also had Muslims attend what we do. From our standpoint, we are a Christian organization, and we're going to share a Christian message. And we make that clear at the beginning when we talk to people. However, when it's time for people to share, we want to hear what other people have to say. And we sometimes adapt a question, perhaps that is about Jesus, and say, who is that person in your life that has showed you grace? Who is that person in your life that has sacrificed themselves for you? Whatever the aspect is of Jesus that we're trying to highlight in the gospel section, we'll ask, who is someone like that in your life? And we'll also just be open to hearing. So this is what we believe to be a very orthodox, lowercase o, Christian belief. What do you think about this? So the questions are really, they're open, and people respond to them based on their own particular beliefs. I pray at the beginning that we be open to other people's beliefs, and that even if we disagree with them, that we learn from them. And I found that kind of openness brings down people's anxiety and defensiveness, and there truly is something to learn from every person's experience. So
yeah, that reflective participatory approach is really, really key to good facilitation and making the group feel comfortable. Thanks for sharing that. And Nurpin, thank you for your great question. I think it's really important to address. Please take a moment to click on the link for your evaluation of this webinar. We would love to hear your thoughts as we move forward and continue to bring other webinars to this working group and to the network. Thank you again for joining us. We are at our time, and wish you all God's blessings and a good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are.